Welcome to the Sacraments. God reaches out to us, and today is session 3, and today is May 19th, and so we are dealing with how the church has practiced Christian initiation. Last Sunday, when we talked about baptism, we talked really about the theology of baptism, with the idea that baptism is the single, unrepeatable act of Christian initiation. When you are initiated, you're initiated. When you are baptized, you become a member of the body of Christ. 1 Corinthians 12, Romans 12. And you also, in Paul's theology, enter into the tomb. You are co-buried with Christ, Romans 6. And so the issue, of course, in this today is the question of how the church has practiced Christian initiation. One of the things that we all have to remember is that when we talk about liturgy in the church, or many other things in the church, you have to talk about not only how things were understood in theory or in theology, but also how the things actually were done in actual practice. And so today we will talk not so much about the theology of baptism, but the practice of Christian initiation, including this thing called confirmation. And you know that the bishop is coming August the 11th. We're probably going to give you a prayer book. And I'm going to sign it, and the bishop's going to sign it too, I believe. And the books that are on that table there include the SBL Study Bible, and the book that's a little funny is the Episcopal Handbook. It's got a lot of humor in it. And also the book by Holmes is very good. And of course, the important thing, if you are not familiar with the stuff in the back of the prayer book that's called An Outline of the Faith, commonly called the Catechism, it would be great for you to get real familiar with that. Now, remember, this definition of the sacraments mostly comes from St. Augustine. And most of our sacramental theology in the Western Church, and we are part of the Western Church too, most of our theology comes from St. Augustine of Hippo. He was the #1 theologian of the Western Church after St. Paul. And in the prayer book, this prayer book, it says, the sacraments are outward and visible signs of inward and spiritual grace. And then the important part, given by Christ. In other words, Christ instituted the 2 sacraments of baptism and the Eucharist, given by Christ as sure and certain means by which we receive that grace. If we were a morning prayer parish, you would be familiar with the general thanksgiving, and one of the things that we give thanks for, several of the things we give thanks for are the means of grace and the hope of glory. And the means of grace are the sacraments and prayer. And so the outward signs are visible. The grace that God gives us, which is the unmerited favor, God gives us this favor. We don't really do anything to get the grace. God gives it to us, and that's why they call it grace. And so that divine grace, which is invisible, is nonetheless real. Baptism is permanent. And this prayer book says that baptism is full initiation into Christ's body, the church, which means a person who is baptized may receive Holy Communion. And that was a change from the 1928 prayer book, a big change, one of the biggest. Baptism in the New Testament is the single rite of initiation into the Christian faith. And in the 1st and 2nd century, something called confirmation did not exist. And so this is next week. So in the first few generations, the large majority of people who were initiated into the Christian faith, in other words, were baptized, were adults. See? They were adults who made the conscious, intentional decision to become Christians. They underwent, in some places, they underwent 2 years of catechesis. And therefore, they were mostly adults, although St. Paul says that he baptized the house of Stephanas. And so before the Edict of Milan in 313, it was frequently illegal to be a Christian in the Roman Empire. And so Christians were being persecuted, and there were tremendous persecutions in the 2nd century and in the 3rd centuries. There were many martyrdoms in 177 in Lyon, France. And so it was dangerous for Christians to gather for worship, and they did so in secret. So they weren't going to let people be baptized until they were really sure they were really wanting to be Christians, in case they were, in other words, they wanted to make sure they were not spies. And so at the Edict of Milan, the Emperor Constantine made Christianity not the official religion of the empire, which he probably would have liked to do, but he made Christianity a religio licita, a legal religion. And it actually tolerated all religions equally. And the church was already growing. And the Edict of Milan, making it legal to be a Christian, caused the church to grow more rapidly. And it was no longer generally dangerous to be a Christian, and you were not accused of atheism under Roman law if you were a Christian. And in the authentic letters of Paul, one of the things that you see in the letters like Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, the 7 letters that we have no doubts about Paul's authorship of, the apostle is the head honcho in the church. The apostles are alive. The apostle of the Pauline churches is Paul. Sometimes when Paul cannot be there, he appoints usually Timothy or Titus to go and be his deputy in his place. And then he appoints episcopoi. Do you see that oi ending on it? That means they're plural. And so in Philippians 1:1, Paul greets the Christians in Philippi, and to the episcopoi, plural, and diakonoi, plural. So an episcopoi is plural of episkopos, see? So episcopoi are called overseers or supervisors, and we use the term bishop for that. And in Philippians and in the authentic Pauline letters, they are plural. And diakonoi can be either male or female. Phoebe is a diakonos. By the way, the term deaconess or diakonissa didn't exist until the 4th century. So Phoebe is a diakonos of the church at Cenchrea, which is one of the 2 port cities of Corinth. And in the authentic letters of Paul, the word presbyteros, an elder, which stands behind the English word priest, is not used. So in the authentic, undoubted letters of Paul, presbyteroi are not there. That word does not occur singular or plural. However, after Paul died, the pastoral epistles were written. And in particular, 2 Timothy is kind of different. But 1 Timothy and Titus are deeply concerned with church order. And in the pastoral epistles, and also in the book of Acts, the term presbyteros is used, meaning an elder. And in the pastoral epistles, the leadership of the church does not include apostles because they're dead, see? The apostles are gone. There's only one episkopos, singular, per church. And there are several presbyteroi and several diakonoi. And so the head person is the one and only episkopos in the church in a city. And therefore, since the apostles were dead, the episcopoi in the different cities were considered the successors of the apostles. If any bishop tells you that he is an apostle, you say, if you're an apostle, you have to be dead. The apostles are dead, and that's why the episcopoi have the role that was played originally by the apostles. However, the role is different. Apostles were traveling evangelists and church planters and church fixers, whereas an episkopos in a church was the bishop of the city and stayed there in that city or maybe around that city and presided over the church there like every Sunday, see? And so as the church grew after the Edict of Milan, but even before the Edict of Milan, the bishop could no longer be the chief pastor of a single church, but rather the regional chief pastor. the head of a region. And by the way, you get different terms for the regions. The bigger region is called a dioikia, and that word becomes diocese. And the smaller region is paroikia, which means around the area that people live in, to the side of, paroikia. And that's where we get the word parish. Anyway, since the bishop was previously the one and only celebrant of the Eucharist, unless he had to be away because he was off consecrating another bishop, he would deputize one of the presbyters to preside at the Eucharist. And so when the bishop became the regional chief pastor and there became multiple churches that he was somehow in charge of, by the way, the term episcopus means overseer or supervisor or administrator. And when the bishop became the regional chief pastor, the local priest became the normative celebrant or presiding officer of each Sunday Eucharist and each baptism, assisted by the deacons. And until that time, the priest did not normatively celebrate the Eucharist. And so when the bishop could no longer be there, that's when the priest started being the normative celebrant of the Eucharist. Now, by the High Middle Ages, in England, in the 13th century, 2 or 3 things happened. One thing that happened was that St. Thomas Aquinas was the greatest theologian of the Western Church after St. Augustine. And he was quite an interesting fellow. He was referred to as the angelic doctor. And in any event, he believed that only the clergy should receive communion in both kinds, the host and the chalice. Only the priest could receive in both kinds. And the people would only receive communion in one kind, the host, and only probably once a year during the season of Easter. And children, not at all. That was a change from what was being done in the 3rd century. The other thing that happened in the 13th century is, in England, because of nobility and lords and ladies and not wanting to break up the estate between a bunch of different sons, they wanted to keep the estate a really big estate. If a son was a 2nd or 3rd or 4th son, he was not going to inherit the estate, see? And so one of the ways that there would be a position found for the 2nd or 3rd or 4th son was daddy would buy a diocese for him. It was called simony. You would buy church office, you would pay, and the kid would hastily be ordained a deacon, priest, and then a bishop, and he would become the bishop of a diocese. And he might also be the rector of a parish 200 miles away. And he wouldn't go to that parish, he would pay another priest, a curate, a poor curate, to do the work in a parish here, a parish there, while he was bishop up here, see? So this is called pluralism. And so most bishops in the 13th century were not visiting their country and village parishes regularly, even though in the West, the bishops reserved to themselves confirmation, the laying on of hands to people who are already baptized. And so clergy were able to read and write, but maybe not much more than that. And then Archbishop John Peckham, the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 13th century, before the Reformation, required people in England to be confirmed before they were allowed to receive communion. That had never been the law anywhere in the church. He required confirmation before First Communion. And the reason why was this was an effort to force bishops to visit the parishes in their diocese and thus to make confirmation accessible to all Christians in their dioceses. And the rest of the Western Church picked that up and they ran with it. And so what happened was, in the 13th century, before John Peckham, baptism was first, of course, and then communion as a kid, as a child, maybe on the day of your baptism. And the only problem with that is, how do you get communion into the kid? And they had silver straws, etc. And then after that, when the kid could be really instructed, then they would be instructed for confirmation, maybe. Except most of them weren't. After John Peckham's order in England, which was picked up by the rest of the West, he changed the order of Christian initiation to baptism and then confirmation. And then after you were confirmed, probably on the day of your confirmation, you could receive your first Holy Communion. So you can see that was a radical change in the order of Christian initiation. And this prayer book changed the order back. We didn't do anything new, we did something old. We changed the order back to baptism, communion, and then confirmation.
Don't you think that was a requirement, that you also had to make a very substantial offering to be confirmed?
I've never read that.
Okay.
The other thing you had to do under John Peckham, is you had to make an auricular confession.
Confession?
Auricular, or in the ear of the priest. A secret confession in a box or somehow in the ear of the priest. That's an auricular confession. And you had to have baptism, confession, and confirmation, and then communion. So that auricular confession was a part of the deal. So the problem that this created in the Western Church is that children could not receive communion until they were confirmed. And this practice caused the church in the West to confirm children at too young an age, such as 12 years old or 10 years old, if not earlier. Queen Elizabeth I was confirmed as a baby, right? So when you confirm a kid at the age of 12, a few of them get it, but most of them don't. Sorry. And so it also created the understanding that that what confirmation was your ticket to receive Holy Communion. And that was one of the major problems. The other thing is that people didn't do much in the way of Christian formation except confirmation instruction, and then after the kid is confirmed, bye-bye church. See, bye-bye Sunday school, bye-bye any kind of instruction in the church. And that's even more destructive than the other part. And so that was why that it was done that way, because bishops were not making their visitations. So it was to correct an abuse by bishops in England, who were many of them were Lord bishops, you see. That's why the order of Christian initiation was changed by John Peckham. And the problem is that this created the idea that confirmation was something, instead of having to do with being an adult or being mature and making a mature adult decision about, yeah, I'd like to be a Christian, it becomes a rite de passage, a rite of passage, like going through puberty or something like that. And so that really kind of screwed up confirmation, to say the least, to say the very least. In the Eastern Church, because they didn't really have confirmation and bishops didn't have to do it, children were chrismated by the local priest rather than the bishop. And therefore, in the Eastern churches, before the Great Schism, before the breaking off of the Orthodox churches of the East and the Catholic Church of the West, both parts of Christian initiation were done by the local priest in the Eastern churches, as they still are. And so, because of this terrific problem in the Episcopal Church, General Convention allowed children to receive communion before confirmation in 1970, even before the prayer book had been changed. And so then this prayer book said, Holy Baptism is full initiation into Christ's body, the church. And this removed any and all canonical or rubrical restrictions on children's receiving communion, although many Episcopalians didn't believe it, and so they had to pass a separate resolution in 1988. But anyway, in the Roman Catholic Church, St. Pius X, Pope St. Pius X, he did a lot of really good things. One of the things that Pope St. Pius X did was that he thought that the monarchs and princes and nobles in Europe were getting far too uppity. They were thinking of themselves as practically God. You know, all of this, Your Majesty, fancy, fancy language. And so he created the Feast of Christ the King, more or less to slap the European monarchs in the face, saying, you're not the real king, only Christ is the real king. And that was the reason he created the Feast of Christ the King. So I think he did something really good. And the other thing is that in his document Quam Singulari in 1910, he put the order of Christian initiation back to the way it was of baptism, First Communion, and then confirmation later. And so, and in the Eastern Catholic churches and in the Eastern Orthodox churches, children receive communion at their baptism, on the day of their baptism, with a spoon, okay? We can do it too. I've done it. So, there's been a lot of lack of clarity, to say the least. And this prayer book, I think, removes a lot of the unclarity about confirmation. In the course of their Christian development, those baptized at an early age are expected. It doesn't say they're required. You don't actually have to be confirmed to be on the vestry. Did you know that? Because after this rubric was put in page 298, where it says full initiation, then the Episcopal Church had to change the definition of a communicant. And therefore, a communicant in good standing used to be a confirmed communicant in good standing. You had to be confirmed. And now a communicant in good standing means you're baptized. And so the old parish registers, those big books, had a section that was called communicants, like if you transferred people in from other churches. And now that same section is called not communicants, but baptized persons. And so we had to change some canon law at General Convention and in the dioceses to match the rubric on page 298 that says baptism is full initiation. So the idea is we're wanting the kids or whomever of any age to make a mature public affirmation of their faith and commitment to the responsibilities of their baptism and to receive the laying on of hands by the bishop. And that's part of the general rubrics on page 412 of confirmation. And so the big problem is what happens after Christian initiation. And I think that this is the most important question that anyone can ask. Before teenagers or adults are confirmed or received in this church, catechesis is required to take place. When I'm instructing a person either before or after they're baptized, that's called catechesis or instruction. In other words, before people are confirmed or received, the church thinks that we should instruct people in what we as a Christian community believe, including how that is rooted in Scripture and in Christian tradition. And if we don't do that, then we clergy are taking the easy way out. We're giving them, we're giving them the lemon meringue pie before they're getting the roast beef. So we want to give them the roast beef first, and then maybe some vegetables, and then finally the lemon meringue pie. And so what does this mean? Well, the church primarily ministers to people in liturgy, in the worship that we do, with a balance of the Word and the sacraments. Some churches are really big on the Word, the Bible. And we think the Bible is extremely important, properly interpreted, and we balance what we believe about the Word and its power with the sacraments and their power. So we believe in Word and sacraments. And so in our prayer book, Scriptures are to be read and preached on every Sunday as well as other days. And we are very serious about the Word of God. And in the 1979 prayer book, it states this in a section at the very beginning. This is the first paragraph in a section called Concerning the Service of the Church. It says, the Holy Eucharist, the principal act of Christian worship on the Lord's Day and other major feasts, and daily morning and evening prayer as set forth in this book meaning the Book of Common Prayer, They are the regular services appointed for public worship in this church. See? And note that it has daily morning prayer and daily evening prayer. And the old prayer books had that too. And this prayer book, if you turn to morning prayer or evening prayer in this prayer book, or in the 1928 prayer book, it will say daily morning prayer or daily evening prayer. And of course, there's a lectionary that goes along with morning and evening prayer that's called the Daily Office Lectionary. And it's a daily lectionary rather than a Sunday lectionary, although it includes Sundays. So this was, some people believe that the primacy of the Eucharist as the principal act of Christian worship on Sundays, which used to be a massively fought about phenomenon in the Episcopal Church before this prayer book. Some people think that that was not in the 1928 prayer book, but other people, and I believe, that it was implicit rather than explicit. And this rubric on page 13 makes it explicit what was always implicit in the old prayer book. The other thing that we did is that General Convention passed in 2009 and reaffirmed in 2012 and in 2015. They affirmed and then twice reaffirmed the Charter for Lifelong Christian Formation and Education. And the other thing they did was they created a standing committee for lifelong Christian formation and education, which is the highest form of an interim body. The highest interim bodies in the Episcopal Church that are joint are standing commissions. And the people that will make the next prayer book will be the Standing Commission on Liturgy and Music. The people that do Constitution and Canons, there'll probably be a standing committee on Constitution and Canons. And so a standing commission is the highest interim body that carries on the work of General Convention between conventions. And the other part of General Convention that carries on the work but cannot really act to do the work of General Convention is the House of Bishops. The House of Bishops meets a couple of times a year usually, and then the House of Deputies meets only once every 3 years. But in the Charter for Lifelong Christian Formation, which I'll print a copy for you later, it says very plainly that Christian formation and education is supposed to be lifelong. And your education as a Christian is not complete when a teenager or adult is confirmed. And therefore, if you know anybody who has any mind at all, and they do what I do, in any of the churches of the West, you know that mainline churches need to do a better job of formation of their members. The Roman Catholic Church does a very good job. We do a really, really lousy job. And that's why I teach all the time, because I don't want it to be said of me that I wasn't doing my job, okay? By the way, I want to tell you a little bit more about Anglicanism. There are many groups of Christians in the world. The Roman Catholic Church is the largest, with over 1.3 billion members. The Eastern Orthodox churches, they're not all in communion with each other. Some of them are non-Chalcedonian. They're the so-called Oriental Orthodox. And they have about 220 million members. And the Eastern Orthodox churches, after the Great Schism, they were the parts of the church that didn't have their liturgy in Latin. The Roman Catholic Church was the great Latin church of the West. So then, after the Reformation, we had this thing called the Church of England. And then, as a result of a lot of things, there are now 42 member churches of the Anglican Communion around the world. We are the single member church of the Anglican Communion in the United States and Canada, or in the United States. And so Anglicans that are in the Anglican Communion have some 85 million members at least. And then there are other churches designating themselves as Anglicans, but they are not among the 42 member churches of the Anglican Communion. And their bishops don't get invited to the Lambeth Conference. And they do not have people on the Anglican Consultative Council. And so we Episcopalians in the United States, we are the Anglican Communion province in this country. And we now have under 2 million members. We used to have over 3 million members in the 60s, but we now have under 2 million members. So that's where it is. And my belief is that it's important to be a Christian. And I think that if you are a Christian, you ought to be a worshiping, active member of some church. And you ought to have regular access to the sacraments, and you ought to have regular instruction and preaching in the Word. And if you don't have preaching or instruction in the Word of God, and you do not have regular access to the sacraments, then to my way of thinking, something is really missing. Okay, I actually have 11 minutes. And so I would take questions, please. And you have to shout.
You said a comment maybe before the lesson about a morning prayer parish. What does that mean?
After the Revolutionary War in this country, there were not many Anglican clergy. Most of the Anglican clergy fled. Many of them went to Canada. They were Church of England priests. Some stayed. One of them was was a chaplain to the Continental Congress, and his name was William White. He was the rector of Christ Church in Philadelphia, 2nd Street above Market Street. And so there was a severe shortage of ordained clergy in the United States, and immediately after the Revolutionary War, no bishops. And so without bishops, you can't have confirmation and you can't have ordination. See, that's serious. And so there was a great shortage of priests. And so when you don't have a priest, you can't have a Holy Communion. See? And so then they would have lay readers or readers. They're called readers in the Church of England. And they're called lay readers in this church. Well, now they're not called lay readers, they're called worship leaders. And you can lead a service that's a morning prayer service, morning prayer and sermon. And of course, lay people don't have the right to preach a sermon, but they can be given that right. But morning prayer services, morning prayer parishes are churches that used to have communion only the first Sunday of the month when they had a priest, and the other Sundays they had morning prayer. And then the lay readers could get a copy of what were called lay readers' sermons, and then later they were called selected sermons. And you could read a sermon written by a priest or a bishop of this church. And so there used to be a war, kind of a war, not always a friendly war, but usually sometimes friendly, between morning prayer churches and Holy Communion churches. And then a compromise was you'd have Holy Communion every other Sunday. And then the other compromise is that the normal service at the late service, like 11 o'clock, you would have morning prayer. But some people wanted to receive communion every Sunday, so they would have an early service at 7 or 7:30 or 8 that would always be Holy Communion. And that was the reason for 8 o'clock services originally. And so after World War II, clergy were trained a little better in seminary, and clergy who went to seminary read Didache, and they read that Eucharistic prayer in Didache of the 12 Apostles, and they especially read Justin Martyr's First Apology. Justin Martyr wrote from Rome in about 150, and in his First Apology he describes a Sunday service, and it's a Eucharist. See? So after World War II, we became more and more high church. And then when this prayer book came out, the Services for Trial Use came out in 1970, and it said, the Holy Eucharist is the principal act of Christian worship on the Lord's Day and other major feasts. And the Virginia people, the Virginia seminary people, didn't like it. So then they moved that rubric from right before the Eucharist to concerning the service in the church where no one would really read it. And then they added the phrase about morning, evening prayer. But they still, high churchmen like me, fought for the Holy Eucharist being the principal act of Christian worship. So that used to be a real big issue in Episcopal churches. And the good thing is that this Book of Common Prayer of 1976 and 79 put pretty much to an end the controversy between morning prayer churches and Holy Communion churches. However, there are going to be a lot more morning prayer churches because there are going to be a lot more churches that don't have a priest. If you don't have a priest, you can't have Holy Communion. Yes, please.
So why do you suppose membership in the Episcopal Church is declining so?
It declined in all mainline churches.
Okay, it's not
And it would be declining in the Roman Catholic Church, I believe. They're increasing, they're growing, but it would be declining in that church if they did not have the people coming in that were Hispanic. I believe that's true. I could be wrong. I wish someone would correct me. But basically, you're about my age, aren't you? We won't go any further than that. But when I grew up in Texarkana, everybody belonged to a church. If you didn't belong to a church, when you talk to people, well, I'm a member of such and such a church. What church do you go to? And a kid would say, we don't go to any church. But that kid would be a rare kid in the South. So it's no longer required to be a member or an attender at a church to be a respectable person, a church or a synagogue, to be a respectable person. And unfortunately, too many people in our churches, they get Christian initiation, but they don't do anything after their Christian initiation. And it's very unfortunate. What happens is, if you're in a church, think of a circle, see? Think of a circle. And you become a member of the church, you enter the circle. If you don't go deeper and become part of a Christian ed class or the choir or the men's group or the women's group or teenage group, if you don't become a part of a smaller group within the church, you stay on this periphery of the circle. See? I got news for you. If you stay on the periphery, the outside, or just barely on the inside of the circle, it's real easy to get yourself out of the circle. So when people become members of churches and we don't integrate them and have them go deeper and go toward the center of the circle would be the priest and the vestry, I guess. If they don't go deeper in the circle and they don't make friends within some small group, they don't identify with a few friends and go deeper or learn more about the Christian faith or learn more about the altar guild or the Bible. If they don't go deeper, a bunch of them you will lose. And that's what's happened. And I say that very sadly, but that's what I've seen for 40 some odd years. In the 80s, there was a fellow named Roy Oswald, I believe, of the Alban Institute, and he wrote a book on, I think it was called The Inviting Church. And then Arlen Routledge wrote books on congregational development. And so basically, when you think of a church as a circle, if you stay on the periphery of the circle, you can get knocked out of the circle real easy. You know how you get knocked out of the circle? Instead of rolling out for church some Sunday, you roll over. You don't have to be mad at the priest or anybody else. You don't have to think, well, they want more money. I'm not going to give them more money. I'm going to stay home. You don't have to think any of those difficult thoughts. All you really have to do is roll over in bed. And, the bed feels too good. And I think I'd like to have some toast and jam, And if you stay on the periphery of the church, that's what will unfortunately happen to many, many people. It's really bad. So I think that classes like these, not just for confirmation instruction, but just in general, I think these classes are good. And I think ECW is good. I'm so proud that we have a men's group. I think it's really good that there are different groups within the church. So do I get to use a visual with a circle and all that? All right. Yes. Well, that would be a pretty good sermon. Yeah. But that comes directly out of a conference that I went to in Philadelphia on new member ministry. The Diocese of Pennsylvania brought in, I think his name was Roy Oswald, and he wrote a book called The Inviting Church. And then I helped to form a group within St. Luke's, Germantown, of people that were interested in new member ministry. The idea is a new member, you get a newcomer, and what happens to the newcomer to help make that person a new member?
I think we do a good job with that.
We are a friendly church. We're a friendly church. I love it that we have kids, and I love it that we're growing. I don't think it's because of anything I'm doing, but I think that a church that's friendly, and I don't mean just talk, but a church that's really friendly, and people like to come to church and they like to have meals together. God knows we like that. That's a real plus, I think, for helping a church grow.